Thank you very, very much, Scott. And thank you to the University of Leeds for inviting me to share my work today. And thank all of you for taking the time out of your lives to join us. There are a lot of people here that I know and that I love dearly. So thank you very, very much. I'm going to start by sharing screen. Okay. So before I begin, I just want to warn you that I live in the country and I have very poor broadband. So if I start breaking up, if things start getting a bit weird, please let me know or let Scott know. And what I'll probably have to do is just turn off my camera for a while. And I should also say that for exactly the same reason, I'm not going to be showing any video or audio clips today because they just never work. As Scott said, my talk is about an hour long, and I realize that that's quite a long time to engage through a screen with so little variation. So thank you. And there's one other thing that I want to do before we get started. I would like to take a moment, please, to remember Professor Chris McCullough, who died last week after a very long illness. Thank you for sharing that time with me. Chris was my PhD supervisor at Exeter, and the journey that I am about to describe today originates many ways with him. And one of the very first things he invited me to do when I became a PhD student at Exeter was to light one of his second year productions that he was directing. It was a Carol Churchill play, and that was almost exactly 30 years ago. When I started my PhD, there was really no such thing, recognizable thing, as practices research in theatre and performance. Although, of course, it did exist with different terminologies and expectations in other disciplines like music, fine art, and creative writing. But Chris McCullough always emphasized the importance of practice in the training of theatre scholars, even if, or perhaps especially if, your research was primarily critical or theoretical or archival. And I suspect this was due to the fact that he was of the generation that established drama as an academic discipline that revolved around praxis. And that was very distinct and meant to be distinct from what took place in English departments. We take it for granted now, but it was still considered a lingeringly radical perspective that scholars should teach practically and create performance as part of a university curriculum. And this was central to my own understanding of my role as a lecturer when I started teaching theatre at the University of Plymouth the year after I began my PhD. So if I had a choice, I would have done my PhD through practice, but I didn't have that choice. And I didn't even know that that was going to become a possibility within the next decade. My doctorate then was about female Jewish performance practice, and it eventually became this book, which was published in 2007. So this charts a lineage of practitioners from Sarah Bernhard in 19th century France to Sandra Bernhard in Fendel Millennium America. And it took me a very long time to finish my doctorate because I was not only learning how to teach and research, but as you will soon hear, I was also making other performances at the same time. And in many ways, my presentation for you today charts the journey through which my research about Jewish women eventually coalesced with my practice. And for the first time today, I am considering my practice research chronologically as it emerged. And I'm going to be focusing on 5 pieces of work. Some of you actually were at some of those performances. Now, to be honest, I'm concerned that this may seem too linear, too inevitable. It certainly didn't feel that way, nor does it reflect what I have fundamentally learned through practice research, which is that every performance embodies both those that came before it and potentially those come after, in and through a single point of encounter. Let's begin. In 1996, I co-founded Lusty Juventus Physical Theatre with my University of Plymouth colleagues Ruth Way and Christine Roberts. Today I'm going to focus on Mother, our fifth and final project, because it was the first one conceived and framed as practice as research. Lusty Juventus projects tackled a wide variety of themes and situations, but they tended to focus on power relations and the mechanism of silencing individual voices. The work always originated with questions related to aesthetics and creative methodologies. Through our first 4 productions, it became apparent that working processes, production roles, and performance disciplines implied hierarchical decision-making processes even in a collaborative practice. So when we made Mother, our aims, which we expressed at the time, were these. First, to model a feminist, non-hierarchical making process, and second, within this, to explore the tensions between process and product, as well as between words, digital imagery, and movement. These were very, very early days of PAR, and we were still struggling with understanding and articulating what research aims might look like. Those certainly would not cut it now. It is probably no surprise that thematically, Mother examined what it means to be a mother and also what it means for a woman not to be a mother. With the filmmaker, we worked with video, visual imagery, and projection as fundamental aspects of a dramaturgical process. And this resulted in the production of Mother 1, which was staged as live theatre that integrated video projection at the Argo Theatre in Athens in 2002. And we also made Mother 3, a 6-minute digital video which was completed and first screened in 2005. Although each worked consciously with the specificity of its medium, so the film was deliberately more abstract, they shared common motifs, themes, spoken words, and characterizations. The performance outcomes of Mother were based on the dislocated experiences of a mother with Alzheimer's and her daughter who subsequently questions her own identity as a result. This scenario was juxtaposed with sections from Algernon Swinburne's The Triumph of Time, which was a poem written in the 1860s. The great sweet mother of this poem also separates motherhood from the maternal, and this was the role that I performed. A decade before we embarked on Mother, I played 6 roles in 1 year. These were all, by the way, in Leeds. Half of them were maids and half of them were sex workers. And it was at this point that I abandoned acting. A number of realizations dawned at once. First of all, I wasn't particularly adept at mimetic representation of character. 2, my body or my presence was too easily conflated with types of character that did not correspond with who I then thought I was. 3, I wasn't particularly excited by naturalistic theatre. And 4, that I was much more interested in considering an entire stage picture from an external material perspective than my specific role within it from an internal psychological one. So I started directing. Now, at the same time as a spectator, I was most engaged by live art or body art practices. And I'd been trying to identify and analyze performative slippages in theatrical representation as a result. Now, because of funding limitations, I came to the project of Mother knowing that I actually had to perform despite all of my misgivings. And basically, we didn't have enough money for all of us to go to Athens, so we had to do more than one job. And because of our research imperative, Mother 1 was deliberately and consciously not directed. It's also important to note that it was not co-directed, unlike previous Lusty Juventus productions. Put simply, it was formed and refined by 3 bodies with 3 perspectives making decisions together in one theatrical space. So the dramaturgical and thematic starting points for this production were our collective questions about the meaning of motherhood personally and politically. And then for me as an individual performer, the understanding that my body, in particular my height, you can't tell that right now, but I'm 5'11", and my hair is both ordinary and extraordinary. So when I direct others, I began by developing my own performance the same way that I was directing others. And that is by using intuitive scraps that felt right, both together and in terms of the wider goals for the productions. So in this case, it was Swinburne's poem and a visual image. And the image was of me on a beach, wrapped in material and wearing high heels, crushing a circle of eggs underfoot. And I performed this action, which we called Mother Naught or Mother Zero or Mother Egg, because zero looks like an egg, 2 months before we entered into a rehearsal space. The footage that was recorded on that day, along with that of Ruth and Chris exploring gesture and relationship in a summer garden, formed the basis of the video projection used for our performances in Athens. More than this, however, the videoed actions and our dialogue with them as they were edited into the projection was the foundation of our character development and nonverbal stage languages. So my process took me from the interaction between site specificity and what Michael Kirby called non-matrix performance, to an interaction between stage space and the scripted scenario of mother and daughter that was offered by Chris, who was a playwright. What I was hoping to create was a stage persona that acted as a metaphor, but did not simulate. And I can see now that this marked the beginning of a long journey of exploration. The 35 meters of green satin material that bound me on the beach was unwound across the stage like a web, compartmentalizing it, restricting and encasing the other narrative. The poem, which was bodied and disembodied, punctuated this other script, recited through a radio mic and with a heavy echo. The shoes, they were lost in the rehearsal process and not without a fight, as it became clear that the persona that needed to emerge was grounded and sure-footed, and that unfortunately, my untrained body needed a firmer basis on which to push through the stage space, sort of like a steamer. The eggs, difficult, if not a health hazard to work with in a live context, were condensed into a single image of life, identity construction, and death at the end of the play, my only direct interaction with the others. And this was a material sign that was not meant to be read as a material body. So fundamentally, what I did on stage was unwind and recite. I became set and setting. And it could be said that in this way, I directed, or was rather allowed to direct, as I always had done, spatially, non-linearly, and in a heterogeneous symbolic landscape. This time, however, the patterns, visual, oral, narrative, were created from within the stage space. No final decision was mine alone. There was no external I or I, and I have never formally directed a theater production since. A few years after Mother One, but while we were still working on developing other modes of presentation for the project as a whole, I began working on a project that became Walking, Writing, and Performance. So while attending a symposium on site-specific performance at Exeter University in 2004, it occurred to me that 3 people I knew fairly well all generated autobiographical performance texts by engaging in the fluid relationships between specific places. I simply noticed that for Dee Hedden, Carl Lavery, and Phil Smith, who I believe is with us today, all in different ways, the acts of walking, remembering, and writing, and thus the construction of narrative self and performance spaces, were intimately related. This book was finally published in 2009, and it comprises 4 autobiographical theatre scripts, 1 each by Carl and Dee, and 2 by Phil, plus an essay by each that describes the processes of making them, as well as their theoretical and critical and historical groundings. Now, there are many ways to engage with published performance texts, and one of the most common ones, as we all know, is to actually perform them. But what happens when you perform someone else's autobiographical performance text? Is it still autobiographical? Is there any difference between the autobiographical performer and any other? And so, in an attempt to explore these questions in order to prepare the introduction to the book, or even discover whether they were valuable and appropriate questions to begin with, I decided to perform one of the scripts in the book myself. And the one I chose was Dee Hedden's 1 square foot tree. Now, this had nothing to do with the fact that we're both women and of generally similar ages. I was not interested in passing as Dee or being believable, quite to the contrary. Now, when I asked Dorinda Halpin, who led Dee's collaborative devising process, for her permission to perform the text, I struggled with a word, to find a word for what I wanted to do with it. And she suggested to me that what I wanted to do was to act. And this made me deeply uncomfortable for some reason, but actually it was a completely apt word, since to act does not simply refer to mimetic representation. It also means to operate, to be, to do. So in conceiving this project, there were very few guiding principles, but one of them was that I had to perform all of the words that the author had intended to say in their performances in the right order. And because I'm not very skilled at remembering lines, I had to choose the shortest script. I also decided to perform to camera, originally anticipating that the process and its aesthetic result would resemble the documentation of a cited performance event. So Dee's text had a number of advantages, including that the tree around which her performance was based was within a couple miles of the house I was living in. Like Dee's, my process of creating and staging what was eventually simply called Tree was a collaborative one. Unlike her version, and partly to mediate against and destabilize assumptions of the camera's authoritative status, my collaborator intervened into the very fabric of the performance text. Tree was made with my daughter, Siobhan, who at the time was predominantly a filmmaker and had substantial experience of live performance documentation. Siobhan's voice is presented in subtitles that were originally intended to undermine the authenticity of the words I speak. So for instance, when I claim that my dad was a forester, like Dee's, Siobhan's voice in writing at the bottom of the screen says, "My grandfather was a banker." The fact that I am not and cannot be Dee is reinforced constantly by Siobhan's interventions. And these represent knowledge based on traditional familial transmission. Through a variety of techniques, mainly made to make me look stupid or fake, Siobhan attempts to reassert herself as the custodian of memory that is in the process of always being compromised. In fact, everything in the video that appeared to be most authentic was not. The subtitles were not really Siobhan's voice. We wrote and placed them together. The one and only line that was not in Dee's original text was rehearsed and performed more than any other one in the film until it appeared to be spontaneous, unlike all of the others. That was the line in which I realized that I wasn't actually performing in front of Dee's original tree at all. And it wasn't even a sequoia, as I was claiming. Now, Siobhan and I were absolutely convinced that it would be impossible for anybody watching this film to associate my body and voice with the personal memories I recount in it, not least because my accent is evidently not Scottish. But we were wrong. Many of the people who watched our version of Tree in my company, for instance, at research events, believed, at least from time to time, as one person put it, that the speaking I of the video was directly referring to my own personal history. And these included people who had known me for many years. Above and beyond all the other planted clues in the video, They knew that my name was not D. I subsequently came to understand that even though I never tried to be D, I was never not her either. I borrowed from what might be considered non-representational styles of performing, for instance, by imagining I was the presenter of a documentary, but I tried to be myself, not a particularly likable version, but myself within the confines of D's words, rather than to embody them. In doing so, I thought a lot about my own childhood and its suburban landscape in Windsor, Ontario. In speaking D's memories, I conjured my own memories and those of my family. And while doing so, my material body was firmly located in the site from which these specific words and these memories they describe arose. So I effectively discovered one way to perform myself, or to perform like myself. This, together with the insertion of my own childhood photographs and my daughter's presence, probably make the film as a whole seem very real indeed. And perhaps what should have surprised me most was not that anyone did believe me, but that they did not. I sang Dee's final words in the film as she had sung hers. You can find or make a root, my story in your story. Your life is not yours alone. And they really sum up why tree is so pivotal within my body of practice research, because it so firmly demonstrates the complicated business of separating authorial voice from the voice produced by a specific body, as well as narrative time and place from the here and now of performance. Downtown. Downtown was created and presented as my inaugural professorial lecture, and it was no coincidence that it was performed on my 45th birthday. It was 90 minutes long, and it was structured in 3 parts, each of equal length, although it was their interstitial moments that were perhaps most crucial to their overall meaning. Now, I didn't actually participate or even see the first part myself, which was performed by my colleague, Victor Ladron de Guevara, in the large reception area outside the theatre. In addition to wine and nibbles, a very large birthday cake was on display, not to be cut or eaten yet. Victor was listening to a welcome speech by my mother, Sharon, who is also here with us today. Now, my mother is extremely proud of me and my achievements. You might even hear about that later. She told a few stories about my precociousness as a child, and Victor relayed this live to the audience, and it included a number of toasts. When he finished, the audience was led into the auditorium. Victor brought the cake. Part 2 took place on the stage, which was decorated like a suburban living room. Audience members were encouraged to sit or stand or mill about on it, although they could also sit in the rake seating facing the stage end on. There were closed circuit cameras situated on the stage, which meant that those in the auditorium had a close view of what happened there. About 2/3 of the audience members chose to hide in the dark rather than interact with me on stage. Those who did were welcomed to my birthday party. It is 1985, and we are in Southfield, Michigan, which is a suburb of Detroit. My name is Bobby, and I am your hostess, the birthday girl. I'm working the room this evening. And I am something of a local celebrity, because 14 years ago, I made a commercial, and it is still shown every year at Christmas. I am Bobby, who once and always will be the Tell 12 Mall elf. And just for fun, I'm wearing my elf costume tonight. Well, actually, I got too big for the original elf costume, so I'm wearing a new one that I made myself. Called upon to give my birthday speech, I sing a bit, I reminisce, I try not to be too bitter. I love my 2 children, who with their 2 friends are helping me out because my husband left me, making sure that the party runs smoothly. the cake is cut. With the help of Victor, who taught me method acting at Oakland Community College. And he is the face of Edie's Tamales in Mexican Town, down by the bridge. Eventually, I go off to slip into something more comfortable and stylish. The audience are asked back into the auditorium for the formal lecture part of the evening. And I'm introduced by the dean, who is kind and he is glowing and he assures everybody that I know what I'm doing and I'm about to explain it. There is some relieved applause. And then the music starts and the spotlight is switched on and I appear wearing a polyester caftan that happened to belong to my grandmother. I sing Petula Clark's Downtown to a karaoke tape, but the words are changed to those I once heard in a comedy club in downtown Detroit when I was 15 years old. Downtown, that's where the perverts are. Downtown, that's where the junkies are. Downtown, the rapists are waiting for you. I dance a bit. And I speak into the microphone. I can sense, I don't know, a little frisson in the air. You were expecting me perhaps to, I don't know, stop performing, at least so explicitly, to be myself. But I promise you, I am. And I have been from the moment I stepped out onto the stage tonight. And then I remove the caftan, I move to the lectern, and I do something that people recognize as a lecture. And one of the things that I discuss in this lecture is my own personal investment in the research material. Now, there are obviously numerous types of text working separately and together in the performance I just described. The most obvious being the lang and parole of the dramatic script. Now, most of those operate through first-person utterance, which both mimic and complicate our understandings of word-based and corporeal textualities, which contribute, along with spatial and temporal experience of distance, to the construction and experience of what we might understand to be a performance text. So in other words, my mother's text, the one that welcomed audience members to downtown, would likely be read as an effect of Victor's or my own body. And this is exactly how it was intended to raise questions about framing, mediation, context, and construction, as well as the nature and authenticity of performing voices, just like Tree. My mother's words were supposed to mirror and complement the blurring of boundaries between inside and outside of the auditorium, between me and Bobby the Elf. Now, according to Roland Barthes, text must be understood as a production of what he calls signifiance. And he's referring to a process that occurs when the subject enters and explores the work and is struggling with meaning or contradiction until they're lost or disappear. A performance text, therefore, is that which produces an unstable subject who is both signifying and signified. And perhaps paradoxically, this is nowhere more evident than an autobiographical performance. As Dee had noted, and as I explored in Tree, autobiographical practice constructs a represented and layered sense of self. The collapse of the performing I into the represented I often unsettles the fictional/real binary and produces a subject that is always contingent and in process. Now, I seem to have an awful lot in common with Bobby the Elf. In 1985, we lived just a few miles beyond downtown Detroit. Me to the southeast in Windsor, Ontario, Canada, and Bobby, somewhat confusingly, but not if you're from there, to the northwest in Southfield, Michigan. This is a view of downtown Detroit from Windsor with the Detroit River between them. Here is a more unusual vantage point of Windsor from Detroit. And this is 8 Mile Road, which separates the city of Detroit from its suburbs, and Southfield in particular. You may recognize it from the Eminem song and the movie. Now, as Jerry Herron has noted, the city of Detroit, especially 10 years ago, was just synonymous with the spectacle of urban disintegration. It had become what he calls a borderama, an island adrift from the American imperative of opportunity. The Detroit River and 8 Mile Road are literally borders that separate Detroit from the rest of North America. Now, Bobby was some 20 years older than me in 1985, although I was older than her when I performed her. And in creating her, I embraced my personal history and my memories. They are not necessarily Bobby's memories, although she is born of them. The text I wrote for Bobby was a stringing together of television jingles, catchphrases, songs, poems, and local memory texts. In itself, it was not autobiographical. However, when taken as a whole and preceded by Victor's channeling of my mother and followed by a lecture which explained the source material, Downtown Like Tree was a deeply revelatory text, especially to myself. So once again, working through a range of performance registers and textualities, I was struggling to represent corporeality as something that exceeds the mimetic. I created Bobby the Tell-12 Mall Elf primarily to embody, discuss, and demonstrate that performers are shaped by specific cities, and they shape those cities. Bobby was not intended as a character, but rather as a conduit. She was meant to reflectively represent cultural memory, localized through individual and collective processes of mapping. Simultaneously, however, I also conceived of her as an alter ego, a second self. Because she expresses my critical ideas through my body, her voice always doubles my own. And ironically, perhaps, I can no longer summon an accurate accent for her. I perform that aspect of self differently now. Now, it's probably also no coincidence that I had been increasingly inspired by watching and experiencing and analyzing the alter egos of other performers, such as Lois Weaver's Tammy Wynot, Bette Midler's The Divine Miss M, Lynn Hirschman's Roberta Brightmore, and Orit Ashery's Marcus Fisher. The relationships between alter egos and their creators are often ambivalent, sometimes liberating, sometimes self-destructive. I can't really pretend to be Bobby any more than I can pretend not to be her, and this has caused me some discomfort, not least because I slowly came to realize that Bobby is the me I was afraid I was going to become in 1985, the year I left North America. In the archive and the repertoire, which is a really foundational text for me, Diana Taylor discusses how Mexico City functions as the mental and material space that provides a framework for individual and collective memory. For Taylor, this in-place cultural memory is an embodied practice, an act of imagination and interconnection. And as such, I wanted Bobby to do cultural memory as cultural memory with all of its complexities. Most of what Bobby says is historically accurate. The places, like the Tell-12 Mall, which is seen here just after it opened in the early 70s, are or once were real. The jingles and the catchphrases were real, as were the local celebrities and the bands she talks about. It is only Bobby herself who occupies a liminal position between fact and fiction. Let me explain. There really was a Tell-12 Mall Elf who appeared in a local television ad repeated year after year at Christmas time. And once, probably in the same year that I heard Downtown in a downtown comedy club and dressed as an elf at a Jewish youth organization convention, I think I met her. She was the mother of an acquaintance, a Jewish housewife living in a suburb of Detroit. I remember nothing else about her, though I was later told that she was the ex-wife of the owner of the summer camp I attended when I was 10. Now, I don't have a very good memory for detail, and she is rarely mentioned in the many Detroit nostalgia sites. In fact, I only found out that her name, at least on the ad, was Judy. For me, the Tell-12 Elf is as ephemeral as Detroit's industrial supremacy, as the bricks and the mortar of the Tel 12 Mall itself, which no longer exists, and as the act of performance, as the nature of memory work. As Alice Rayner wrote in her book, To Act, to Do, to Perform, performance is not a result, but it's a beginning. The doing, she writes, of any given performance will create its own past and become available to the reification, narration, and textuality of the act. Heaven is a Place. Heaven is a Place is a short dance film about 50 minutes long, made in collaboration with members of Plymouth's LGBT communities. Now, it might seem quite different from the other work I'm sharing with you today. For instance, I don't actually perform in it myself, but actually, it's part of a creative trajectory that revolves around sight, place, embodiment, and memory. My own role in it is probably best described as creative producer, and I'm co-credited with the authorship of its screenplay, along with Ruth Way, with whom I collaborated in all of the Lusty Juventus productions, and also the filmmaker Kayla Parker. Heaven is a Place was made during the first half of 2014. Like Lusty Juventus's mother a decade earlier, it arose from an EU-funded cultural cooperation program. We were one of the co-organizers of the program, which was called Heaven on Earth and was led by Odysseia Theatre Company from Athens. In addition to our film, it resulted in a series of workshops across Europe and a touring theatre production by Odysseia, which was performed in Greece and Spain and Turkey and also in Plymouth. What held these activities together was a focus on the French writer, playwright, and activist Jean Genet, who died in 1986. Now, as a whole, Heaven on Earth as a project aimed to both explore and celebrate the aesthetic prescience of Genet's creative work and his ideas, as well as issues stemming from his cultural legacy. What was important to all of us was Genet's insistence on actively recognizing and confronting the oppression of minority cultures, and also the way he makes difficult, subtle, righteous, and challenging political statements in the creative spaces that exist between actuality and illusion. Genet was a remarkably complex man, and 30 years after his death, he continued and continues to exert a huge influence on queer writing, theatre, and film practices. In the development and making of Heaven is a Place, we collaborated with Pride in Plymouth, an organization that celebrates and supports the diversity of LGBT communities in the city. The partnership began with a series of creative workshops, which were led by Ruth and our assistant choreographer, Claire Summers. And all of these workshops were only for people who identified as LGBT or Q. The purpose of these workshops was to introduce a gentle, inclusive, and playful approach to working creatively through movement and gesture. They drew on techniques from physical theatre, from somatic movement practice, and also from dance. The workshops required no previous movement or performance experience, and they were based on the principle that dance exists through the life of the body and can tell us something about who we are and how we feel. Workshop participants who wanted to continue working with us, and pleasingly most of them did, could be involved in further ensemble work in one of the scenes in the film. And a few eventually performed in other scenes as well. But perhaps most significantly, the workshops inspired and taught Ruth and Kayla and I much more about the issues and themes and movement vocabularies that needed to be expressed through conjoined filmmaking and choreographic practices. These evoked the interplay of oppositions which resounded so closely with Genet's work. They include appearing, disappearing, advancing, retreating, including, excluding, imprisoned, released, grounded, and airborne. While making the film, we immersed ourselves in Genet's poetry, which actually was relatively unfamiliar, at least to us, compared to his film and his theatre texts. In Le Pêcheur du Souquet, La Parade, and Un Chant d'amour, we discovered malicious children who make water shiver, bodies hanging from a single foot by the mizzenmast, and feet uncurling the sea. And these are images that resonate very deeply in Plymouth a city defined by its maritime location, its status as a port, and the severe bombing during World War II, which destroyed most of its center. It is a place from which the Pilgrim Fathers set sail to colonize America, which is being observed or celebrated this year. It is a place still dominated by its dockyards and by the Royal Navy. It is often characterized as being on the periphery. The film we made is about a place that is once generic, metaphoric, and specific in its materiality. It is about a place where it has not been easy to be gay or lesbian or bisexual or trans. We drew significantly on the work of Alan Butler, who was then completing his PhD on Plymouth's LGBT history, which I was supervising in collaboration with the Plymouth and West Devon Record Office. Alan was our community liaison and our dramaturge for the film in the European sense of the word, and we reflected many of his findings in the film. One is the extent to which queer culture in Plymouth has been shaped historically by the sexual flexibility of sailors and matelots. Another is that many gay people, paradoxically, have felt less certain of their community and even less safe since homosexuality was legalized and openly gay people could serve in the military. As long as LGBT culture remained hidden in dockside bars and dance halls, it was vibrant and socially and silently accepted. Heaven is a Place also reflected the ideas of the cultural geographer Doreen Massey, for whom space is first and foremost a place of social interactions, the point where stories from the past and the present collide, much as I was exploring in downtown in relation to the city of Detroit. Space is always changing, it's always moving. It is where encounters with other people are produced and where we produce ourselves. Plymouth's massive granite walls and fortresses facing the sea from which our film grew were built to stave off an invasion by Napoleon. Some, of course, were also built to stave off an invasion by the sea itself. Its strength and our vulnerability in the face of its power was made explicit less than 2 months before we began filming, when a monster storm cut the city off from the rest of the country for weeks on end and battered much of its seafront. We had to climb over barricades erected during the long repair process to film many of the scenes. The title of our film is borrowed from a Talking Heads song. Everyone is trying to get to the bar. The name of the bar? The bar is called Heaven. David Byrne sings, Heaven, heaven is a place where nothing ever happens. Because, change is difficult. Accepting other people into your space, allowing them to change it, to change you, is difficult. We made our film against the backdrop of the European election in which the largest political gains in both England and in France were made by nationalist right-wing parties that preyed on the fear of difference and of invasion. We deliberately decided to make a European film 2 years before the Brexit referendum. And Jean Genet reminded us that borders are always instruments of control, sites where inclusion and exclusion are made manifest. He reminded us that the sea connects us to the world and that we can be both on the margin and at the center of complex networks of relations. And so Genet haunts our film, a revenant. It was his time to come back. He puts words into mouths, he places phone calls to bars, and he possesses a vagabond, played here by the aerialist Laura Murphy, who passes through Plymouth en route to the sea, a sea that both delivers her beyond and is itself beyond, and then she finds her stage in the sky. He is conjured by the seance that is Heaven is a Place, attracted by the secret forces of specific places. These are the places that were identified by Plymouth's queer communities as being significant. And our approach to working in those specific sites was influenced by the geographer Edward Ralph. As with Ralph's research methodology, which he described as a phenomenology of place, each site revealed itself over a series of visits, improvisations, and also the moment of filming itself. And so the resulting filmed encounter was intended to embrace the dynamic, multiple shifting intersection of temporal, spatial, and experiential, combining emotional, corporeal, cognitive, and memory registers. After producing Heaven is a Place, which was screened in a number of international film competitions and also on the big screen in Plymouth City Centre during Plymouth's first Pride Festival. In fact, the parade moved under the screen while it was showing. And I wrote a chapter for a book entitled Community Filmmaking Practices. And in it, we discuss why we feel that the process-driven triangulation of thinking bodies, sexual subjectivities, and emplacement, as we explored it in Heaven is a Place, is able to acknowledge and consolidate and reimagine a community that has either been erased or marginalized in dominant accounts of its city. And in this chapter, we try to explain how, by using reflexive locatedness as a guiding principle and developing a strategy that understands publicness as a form of embodied creativity and world making, we begin to model how community film might celebrate and extend diversity through the construction of collectively shared counterpublic cartography, obviously counterpublic after Michael Warner. Ultimately, it is a creative work that attempts to perform a politics of location, what the philosopher Rosie Braidotti calls materially embedded embodied accounts that illuminate and transform our knowledge of ourselves and our world. My final example. On the 16th of January, 2016, that is 16/1/16, I performed Pearl Williams' live comedy album, A Trip Around the World Is Not a Cruise, during a public cabaret birthday party that I organized for myself. Now, I believe in numerical signs and tend to choose the dates I perform very carefully. So my inaugural performance lecture downtown took place on 11/1/11, which is my birthday. Williams recorded A Trip Around the World in 1961, so exactly 50 years earlier. And it was released the following year. It's 40 minutes in total and recorded during a live late night show in a club in New York City. Accompanying herself on the piano and with a liberal sprinkling of Yiddish, Williams jokes about oral sex, vibrators, adultery, promiscuity, prostitution, ethnicity, and class. She's working deep blue. She's throwing in a few belted song parodies and some vaguely liturgical Jewish popular classics, but basically she trades in smut. When it was released, Williams' record had a sticker on it that read, "For adults only," meaning that it was not considered suitable for radio airplay and that it was often kept in record stores. You had to ask for it. My grandfather, he had a copy at my parents' house parties in the 60s and the 70s, at least that's number. Now, I realize that I probably made it sound perform the entire record. No, I didn't, for a variety of reasons, including my lack of confidence in handling the dated problematic nature of some of the material. Actually, I ended up performing a 15-minute set comprising about 12 minutes from A Trip Around the World Is Not a Cruise and the rest sourced from MP3 files that were located over and across the internet from Williams' other albums. And the latter included her Hava Nagila medley, which I performed as a grand finale with the klezmer fusion band Hazar. And Hazar also played 2 extended dance sets that evening as well. And that's what you can see in this image that I'm showing you. Now, the guy on the left in the hat, that is stage right, playing the clarinet, is my ex-husband, Dave. Now, in her sets, Williams' piano playing underlined punchlines. It was absolutely fundamental to her rhythmic structure structure and was part of her. And my piano playing, despite the piano that you can see behind me, is really not up to task. Actually, you can see the album on the piano as well. So I asked Dave to act as my accompanist because he is a professional musician. So Dave and I rehearsed once together, and otherwise we rehearsed separately from Williams' LP, and also a script that I sent him of the material I had chosen to perform. And this was a risky approach, given that timing and rhythm is almost everything when performing comedy, especially comedy that the audience is unlikely to fully understand because some of the punchlines are in Yiddish. Now, in fact, Dave and I had never performed together before, ever, even when we used to be married, which was quite a long time ago. Now, to some extent, I saw the entire performance as a gift to our granddaughter, who turned 1 on that day and who was also at the performance. And I'm telling you this to draw attention to the networks of memory work at play and how these are situated in and between specific bodies in a specific single performance. Now, a few days before the performance, I produced a handout. It was a 1-page document that was posted on the Facebook event page, and it was also printed and available all over the venue on the night. And this document tried to emphasize to anybody who bothered to read it that I positioned this as practice research, and I outlined what were supposedly my 3 main aims. These were, first of all, to locate Williams' material in my body by finding a Jewish voice. Secondly, to interrogate the LP as an act of cultural memory. And thirdly, finally, to interpret Williams' performance from the inside out. So this means that a trip around the world was the first time I explicitly brought together the 2 strands of my research. That is, the making a performance, which I've been discussing with you so far today, with what I had then been simultaneously establishing and analyzing for about a quarter of a century. That is, a female Jewish performance tradition which focused in the 20th century on comedy and popular entertainment. And during this time, I had referenced Williams' record repeatedly, and frankly, quite superficially, mainly to position her historically in a lineage of bawdy musical comedy by American women from Sophie Tucker to Bette Midler. So besides their use of song and Yiddish, the mama lotion or mother tongue of smutty American urban humor, one of the things that these comedians had in common was the way they foregrounded their own sexuality as aging women. And I suspect that this, that is negotiating my own sexuality while aging, is what compelled me to return to this gyna lineage as a performer. And I chose Williams' album because I remember seeing it in the teak cabinet under the record player in our living room when I was growing up. And in certain company, my mother used to perform some of Williams' jokes herself, for adults only. The voice of adult, a blur of my mother and Pearl Williams. The voice of having grown up. Researching performers like Tucker and Williams, I became increasingly aware that my commitment to this performance tradition was associated with my growing respect for a professionalism which was and too often is overlooked. And this began consciously when I went to see Joan Rivers live for the first time in 2002, mainly at that point out of a sense of dutiful curiosity. But what I encountered that night was a consummately professional performer, a woman who knew the business of stand-up. In fact, I would go further. In the moment of performance, Rivers was stand-up, embodying its history and its cross-generational transmission. And I began to understand professionalism in this context as the interarticulated manifestation of experience and performance mastery. Now, at about the same time, I became aware of my own role as an expert spectator, which is a kind of flip side to the professionalism of the performers I study. Expert spectator is a term coined by Susan Melrose to describe somebody who is trained or has trained themselves, not only to, quote, see what she can see, but also to imagine the rest in a way that has been carefully planned for and largely anticipated by performance makers. So eventually, when I finally performed stand-up myself via A Trip Around the World Is Not a Cruise, it was as somebody who learned it not through doing, which is of course the standard route for professional performers, but through years of expert spectating. And if you're a fan of Scorsese's King of Comedy, you might call this the Rupert Pupkin technique. By now, it will not surprise you that one of the things I was adamant about is that my performance was not intended as a reenactment, an homage, or an impersonation of Pearl Williams. And I've always been incredibly dismissive of those sort of schmaltzy nostalgia acts, An Evening at Pearl Williams or whatever, and believe me, they exist. To me, they're live, but they're not living. On another level, as I've been discussing with you today, almost all of my performance research going back nearly 15 years in many genres had wrestled with the problem of acting myself in non-mimetic ways, and this was no exception. So in my performance of A Trip Around the World Is Not a Cruise, as in these previous performances, word-based spoken text became the means through which I augmented my performative self spatially and temporally, and the attempt to balance the demands of representing / acting and presenting / not acting gave rise to quite complex process of embodiment. In his book, The Jew's Body, the Jewish cultural historian Sander Gilman identifies the voice as one of the key markers of Jewishness. This Jewishness, for which read otherness or difference, is compounded when the voice speaks Yiddish, as this is seen as a private Jewish language of the Jews that exposes the impossibility of successful assimilation. And this is a perspective I understand well, since two of my grandparents who emigrated to Canada as young people both spoke Yiddish as their first language. Perhaps because I could only access Williams via her voice on a record, my performance preparation focused almost entirely on my own voice. For a month, I spent an hour or so every day stretching, and then an hour or more doing vocal exercises. And then I spent a few more hours transcribing Williams' words from the record, often having to listen to the same passage over and over again and speaking it back again, over and over and over again. And eventually I shaped the text and essentially rehearsed it by reading it over Williams. She speaks a lot faster than me. She uses her mouth and she uses her throat differently, and like she can sing. There was actually a period in which, out of necessity, I contemplated moving between speaking Williams' words myself and lip syncing to the record. But besides being technically very difficult to accomplish, this would have created more distance between me and Pearl Williams, my body, and the voice, between me and the Jewishness I was exploring. One day, while I was working on the performance, so in other words, while I was doing vocal exercises accompanied by YouTube videos, a Facebook message from my mother popped up on screen, and she had a suggestion for me. "What's your suggestion?" I asked her. "You're a swan." Most of these women, Toady, she was referring to Toady Fields, Pearl, Sophie, were round chickens. When you're practicing, cut the distance between your shoulders and the floor so that you feel shorter and rounder. And while I can't explain it, you'll start feeling more Jewish and funnier. I'm reaching back here, but when I entertained a lot, informally, of course, and when I too was a swan who stood and walked tall, it worked for me. Maybe it will help you. Hugs. And she was right. Of course she was right, as mothers so often are. Effectively, the process of making my performance was one of training my body to produce a certain type of voice that was and was not my own. And I felt more Jewish and better able to embrace Williams' material, not only when I imagined myself short and fat, but also when I concentrated on what I had learned from the training workshops I had been attending for the previous year in preparation to do so. And what I had been trying to learn from this training was how to be confident and powerful in my voice, despite having a limited range and ability to carry a tune, a voice with depth, one that was lower, but was still my own. Now, one of the things that interested me when embarking on this project was how non-Jews, far removed temporally and geographically from the culture that produced William's Act, would react to it. Now, part of me actually expected some laughter, if only because of the recognition of rhythms and patterns of joke telling that are now firmly embedded in the mainstream comedy industry. And part of me expected none, silence, or maybe, nervous, half-hearted, but well-meaning, twitchy snickers, something like that. But two things happened. The first is simply that rather than performing the Jew out of place in a non-Jewish environment, I felt compelled to create a party space in which the default position was Jewish, gloriously over the top, outrageously, and unapologetically Jewish, despite the fact that only about 8 people in the entire room of about 170 were actually Jewish. And most of those 8 were actually performing on the stage. Here are 2 of them. On the right, Marissa Karneski, and on the left, Laszlo Perlman, who was the evening's compere and also acted as my outside eye during final rehearsals. And the second thing, perhaps connected, was that I killed, really. The audience ate it up. They laughed hard. They laughed a lot. It was an extraordinary experience from the stage, the most incredible wave of energy. They got it, even when they didn't specifically understand all the parts that made it. The roar when it was all over was not just relief that I hadn't died on stage. Now, I can't prove that, of course. There's no video. And that is deliberate. The performance, like all of my performances, was an exchange, not something that can be captured on video. And I actually feel that the combination of sound vision seduces too many people into believing that they may read the encounter in similar ways to a live audience. I really do want to avoid that. Now, I had originally planned to make an audio recording and also to press a vinyl LP of it, returning my performance back to the archive. But that didn't quite happen. And you know what? I'm okay with that, as I have to be. Because I need to acknowledge that in not really attending to the making of a high quality recording and leaving it to chance, and here I have to stress that there was nothing else about that evening that was left to chance. Not the candy corn that was sold, not the tea light holders on the table. I was effectively deciding that the performance would not be available as an accessible research output. It somehow feels very Freudian, but in a manner that seems almost passive-aggressive, I ensured that I would not be submitting this performance to the next ref. For those of you who don't know, that's the exercise by which all research is periodically assessed in the UK for the purposes of government funding and departmental ranking. And that is because I knew, or I think I knew, even before actually doing the performance, that the research output itself was my body, and that my research findings were manifest in and inseparable from it. Oh yeah. There were questionnaires, hard copies of them were on the tables in the venues, and there were electronic versions posted on the Facebook event page the next day and before the performances. I even sent a reminder out, but I never really expected them to be returned. Despite some very thoughtful and thought-provoking responses to the 12 or so questionnaires that I got back, what really struck me was the number of people who told me that because of this performance, they looked at me in a new way. Actually, I skipped ahead of myself. Let me just see if I can go back. And you'd think that after my experience with Tree, that, I would have expected this, but I didn't. Many people clearly assumed that deep down I had been harboring a desire to tell filthy jokes In short, that I was coexisting with the material, despite the fact that many of them had known me for over 20 years and had never heard me speak or behave in a way before. The many ideas in my previous writing about comedy and women's comedy in particular that were made evident for me on that evening. That is, that audiences laugh when they believe that that body with that history is capable of saying those words. And I had often wondered why this was the case, and think, as the result of this particular project, that the theorization of ventriloquism offers us a clue. As Stephen Connor notes in his cultural history of ventriloquism, which is called Dumbstruck, voices are both produced by bodies and can also themselves produce bodies. He refers to these bodies as vocalic, and they are created and shaped and sustained through the oscillating operations between speaking object and speaking subject. And the performance produced by such bodies are, for me, as significant for their expression of what cannot be heard. Now, I had always assumed that performance research outcomes embodied what can't be expressed in writing about them. But in performing A Trip Around the World Is Not a Cruise, I became very aware of the ways and the whys that performance research might express what isn't there. In my case, for instance, the choices not to tell Williams jokes that I felt were racist or homophobic, or that asked us to laugh in uncomfortable ways about rape, or how I cut jokes that I thought were just too far removed from contemporary experience and reordered others so they built like a concurrent stand-up act. Okay. So what did I learn about Williams' performance by analyzing it from the inside out? And the best way I can describe this is to return to the concept of professionalism. And this is complicated because here I'm not only talking about a style and technique, but also about content. Now, Williams always played with two associations of being a pro. That is, being a hardworking, disciplined entertainer who knows her craft and business, and also a sex worker. Now, one of Williams' lines always made me laugh when I said it out loud, both in rehearsals, and I should probably remind you that those rehearsals were almost only attended by myself, and on stage in front of others. And this was not laughing as professional strategy, what Tony Alec about stand-up calls timing the corpse. He describes that as a technique used to engage the audience in the now by shifting from one seemingly authentic emotional state to another. Now, I've learned how to do that too. But here, I simply mean that I really laughed because I was and remain able to recognize my body, its history, and its present working conditions in these words. Oh boy, am I a nut? If I was normal, would I be able to do this job? Never in a million. Nothing does what I do for a living. So I'm a whore in Chicago. I want to stay with the concept of professionalism by way of concluding this lecture, and in particular, the incompatibility of professional expectations within the academy for practice researchers. So in many ways, being a senior manager for the past 15 years, so associate dean, director of a research institute, and then for the past 5 years, director of the university's doctoral college, has actually been the defining condition of all elements of my research. It has shaped both the trajectory of my performance practices research and also the nature of specific projects. I have shifted from company to solo work, from touring productions to film or one-off performances, not because it suited me or even particularly the nature of my practice at that stage, or even the nature of my research inquiries, but because that was all that was possible. And that's really the case, unless you bring in a lot of external money to buy you out of your time, which is also virtually impossible when you're a senior manager. But raising that money is incredibly difficult for those whose practice practice cannot be easily commodified or articulated as commodifiable, either within the cultural economy sector or our highly competitive research economy. So to be a professional academic largely forecloses on my having a professional creative practice in the field in which I research. And unable to develop that creative practice professionally means that I will always struggle to meet measurable criteria of research quality. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm going to stop. And I recognize a luxury or made a possibility by my current status and position of privilege in an educational system, which increasingly is defined by its precarity. But for me, the practice element of my research has become inseparable to my thinking and understanding processes. It also feels like a compulsion. And the images here are of a performance, the last performance I made in February 2020, just a few weeks before lockdown. And it was for the launch event of a book I co-edited about the artist Joshua Sofaer. Now, having reviewed my practice research trajectory to share with you today, I can see that there are some glaringly obvious familiar tropes and techniques at work in this performance. The obsession with dates, the obsession with patterns, cultural memory and enactment of the self through the stories of other Jewish women presented as my own. In this particular case, it was the character of Roberta in Desperately Seeking Susan, who I had written about in relation to Lynn Hirschman's Roberta Brightmore alter ego nearly a decade ago. So this performance is just another example of what I've been reaching toward, often intuitively, for a very long time as an artistic researcher. That is, the generation of insight that not only combines methodologically, but is also about familial, aesthetic, and cultural histories and genealogies, that explores how to prepare for intersubjective exchanges in moments of performance that are always characterized as an event, and that acknowledge that the present always includes absence. That is, what is no longer, and perhaps has never even been here. Thank you for staying with me. I look forward to talking now.